Welcome back to Indus News with me, Osman Lone. Well, we start from Doha, where the 7th round of talks between the United States and the Taliban wrapped up after signs of progress in an effort to end the war in Afghanistan. US envoy Zalmay Khalilzad met Taliban officials a day after a delegation of Afghan citizens and the Taliban agreed on a roadmap for peace. Khalilzad will return to Washington to brief US officials on the Afghan peace process. The US government is expected to make an announcement after a briefing from him. Well, for more on this, we're joined by our correspondent in Washington, that's Daniel Renches. Daniel, thank you for joining us here at Indus. Well, it seems like we've got some success. I mean, it's a pretty big deal, but can you explain, for the sake of clarity and for the people at home, what this actually means? Because senior members of the Afghan government and Taliban officials, or representatives per se, weren't even sitting in the same room before, and now they're saying they want peace.
Well, I think the US, the administration, would like to withdraw from Afghanistan, but that's not a simple matter. So in order to make this something that Donald Trump could boast to the American people when he goes to the polls, he needs to find a way of doing it in practical terms. The barriers to withdrawal of the US are pretty clear. Mainly that the concern of the Trump administration has been that the Taliban would essentially start to take over and also foment further terrorism in the future. So the talks between the US and Taliban apparently are showing some fruit. But I think part of that potential for success is the fact that we've had this intra-Afghan dialogue that Zalmay Khalilzad, the US Special Envoy, has praised today as well on Twitter. So it suggests that they are trying to work in concert between the negotiations between the US and the Taliban and trying to get sections of Afghan society, including the Afghan government, on board. But, you know, this is a major challenge. So perhaps Khalilzad is going back to Washington to tell Trump that they have a deal, but we don't know the exact terms, and there are many obstacles along the way.
You're right, and one of those obstacles is obviously violence. There was another explosion today in Afghanistan and another airstrike, in fact. So, I mean, do you think Congress will back a political settlement with the Taliban and a US troop pullout from Afghanistan? As you know, there's a lot of US sentiment for the soldiers over there on the ground in Afghanistan. Do you think they'll agree to this?
Well, there is a lot of political space that Donald Trump could potentially exploit here because the US has spent over $1 trillion in Afghanistan. So if he were to come back with a deal that looked coherent, there would be criticism, of course, especially from the Democrats, but there would also be scrutiny of the details of the deal. So, for example, what did the Taliban give back to the United States in return for the potential withdrawal of US troops? What have they agreed to? Have they agreed to give up weapons? Have they agreed to engage in a fulsome political reconciliation process and to take part, but also to guarantee that the central government in Afghanistan would be supported by a future sort of political movement of the Taliban? So there are lots of questions going forward about the degree to which Donald Trump would be supported. And I think that's why he sent Khalilzad, who's a skilled political actor in the region, and therefore is probably the best place of Trump's allies to secure a future agreement that is both aspirational and practical.
Daniel, thank you very much for joining us on News. That was Daniel Renches in Washington, D.C. Now, we were talking about Afghanistan, and in Afghanistan today, just 7 members of the same family have been killed in an airstrike in the northern part of the country. Afghanistan's defense ministry says the airstrike was conducted for eliminating hostile elements from Baghlan province. An Afghan Defense Ministry team is investigating the incident. The airstrike led to protests as demonstrators marched through the streets carrying the victims' remains in trucks. A Baghlan Provincial Council member says the civilians were farmers and had no connection with any militant group. The attack comes after the first intra-Afghan dialogue in Doha ended with a pledge to a roadmap for peace. Now, Iranian Foreign Minister Javad Zarif says US President Donald Trump has been lured by allies into killing the 2015 nuclear deal. Zarif says Trump's national security advisor John Bolton and Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu also foiled the Paris Agreement in 2005 by insisting on zero enrichment of uranium. This comes after the UN nuclear agency, the IAEA, confirmed that Iran has begun enriching uranium beyond a limit set by the 2015 deal. US Vice President Mike Pence says Washington doesn't want war with Iran, but is ready to protect its interests. Iran insists global powers must uphold their commitments under the deal if they want Tehran to return to the agreement. Now, at least 3 people have been killed and 4 others wounded in mortar attacks in northern Iraq. Police believe ISIS militants are involved in the attack. Earlier, 3 ISIS militants were killed during a US-led offensive in central and northern Iraq. In Salahuddin province, troops found 4 car bomb-making sites and seized 30 rockets. Well, Yemen's Houthi rebels have called for the complete withdrawal of military coalition forces from the country. This comes after the UAE said it's reducing the number of troops it's deploying in the country. A UAE official says Abu Dhabi is turning from a military strategy to a peace plan. He says the UAE will remain committed to the internationally recognized government of President Abdul Rabbi Mansour Hadi. A spokesman for the Saudi-led coalition says both the UAE and Saudi Arabia are committed to their goals inside Yemen. Now, China has told the US to withdraw a potential multi-billion-dollar arms sale to Taiwan, saying it violates the One China principle. The US has approved a $2.2 billion weapons deal in a move bound to anger China. More in this report.
The deal includes over 100 tanks and 250 Stinger missiles. During a media briefing, China's foreign ministry spokesman Gang Shuang says Beijing strongly opposes the action.
It is a crude interference in China's internal affairs and harms China's sovereignty and security interests. China is strongly dissatisfied and firmly opposed to this and has already made 10 representations to the US side.
The US Congress has been notified about the arms deal and has 30 days to object. The transaction goes against Beijing's One China policy because it sees Taiwan as a renegade province.
Staying with China and their controversial extradition bill that hit Hong Kong with mass protests, the leader's now saying it's dead. Lam has not completely withdrawn the proposed legislation on moving suspects to mainland China, but protesters promised new rallies demanding a complete withdrawal of the controversial bill. Addressing a press conference, Lam admitted there are lingering doubts about the legislation on extradition to China. Carrie Lam said she would hold an open dialogue with the youth of Hong Kong. OPEC has called for a quick resolution of tensions among Venezuela, Iran and the United States. In an interview, OPEC Secretary General Mohammed Barkindo said the world needs peace and stability to ensure growth and development. He said Iran and Venezuela will remain exempted from OPEC production quotas. 2 Turkish soldiers have been killed in a Kurdish militant attack in the country's southern Hakkari province. The Defense Ministry says the attack was carried out from a distance. 1 soldier has also been wounded in the attack by PKK militants. The nature of the attack is not yet clear. The PKK is listed as a terrorist organization by the Turkey, the US and United States and the EU. Well, the European Union has expressed grave concern over Turkey's deployment of a second ship to drill for natural gas off the coast of Cyprus. It says the operation of northeast Cyprus is an unacceptable escalation, violating Cypriot sovereignty. The EU's top diplomat Federica Mogherini says the European Council is considering appropriate measures against Turkey. Cyprus has been divided since Turkish forces intervened in 1974 to prevent a union with Greece and protect the ethnic Turkish minority. Tensions flared last month between Ankara and Nicosia after a Turkish ship dropped anchor near the Mediterranean island to drill for gas. Turkey disputes the right of the Cypriot government to exploit gas reserves and sent the ships to reinforce its claim. Well, staying with Turkey, and the Turkish police have begun nationwide raids to arrest over 200 military personnel linked to FETÖ. The officials said suspects have ties with the group blamed for the 2016 coup attempt. Prosecutors said they issued arrest warrants for 228 suspects, including a colonel, 5 majors and 100 lieutenants. They said the suspects have alleged links to Muslim preachers Fethullah Gulen's movement. Russian President Vladimir Putin says he's against economic sanctions on Georgia. Putin says he opposes any measures that would harm Russia's relations with its neighbor. This comes after the Russian parliament adopted a resolution urging the government to slap sanctions on Georgia. Lawmakers called for the sanctions in reaction to Georgia's unfriendly actions towards Moscow. But Moscow is irked by anti-Russia protests in Tbilisi and a tirade against President Vladimir Putin on a Georgian TV channel. The Kremlin has already suspended passenger flights between the two countries. Serbia has accused Kosovo and Albania of coordinating foreign policies to create a joint state in the Balkans. Both countries have simultaneously boycotted a regional conference taking place in Bosnia. Serbia's Foreign Minister Ivica Dačić says the boycott of the summit is part of a strategy to create a greater Albania. He says Kosovo and Albania have created serious problems by not attending the Southeast European Cooperation Process Summit. The EU has told all parties that good neighbourly relations are one of the key preconditions for Balkan countries to move to accession. Kosovo says it refused to attend the summit in Sarajevo because it wasn't invited as a sovereign country. Albanian Foreign Minister Gent Sakac said Tirana pulled out of the event in solidarity with Kosovo. In Albania, thousands of opposition supporters have resumed protests calling on Prime Minister Edi Rama to step down. They say the country's accession to the EU may be blocked if there isn't no change at the top. Demonstrators in Tirana call for Rama's resignation over corruption and electoral fraud allegations. Rama, who won a second term in 2017, has dismissed all concerns about the election results. The opposition says Rama could jeopardize Albania's accession to the EU, but EU member states are due to make a decision themselves later this year. Now, it seems there's a growing trend in Asia of people sending back rubbish to Western countries, and Indonesia has also stepped in, saying it's planning to send back over 210 tons of trash to Australia. This also comes after the Philippines sent waste containers back to Canada. More details in this report.
This is the second time in less than a month that Indonesia re-exported contaminated waste. The 8 containers seized at Indonesia's Tanjung Perak port contained plastic bottles and electronic products. A port official says 3 companies are involved in the shipment.
Like I said before, there are 3 companies involved. It is up to the companies to decide when they will re-export. Once they submit the request, we will investigate and act accordingly.
Indonesia, Malaysia and the Philippines are sending back trash amid a spike in imports from Western countries. The move has disrupted the global flow of millions of tons of waste each year.
Well, Turkey is home to over 3.6 million Syrian refugees as it shares a border with the country. And that's the largest population of persons displaced by the 8-year civil war hosted by any country. But it seems anger is rising among the public against refugees amid a stumbling economy. Indus News has this report.
Shops with Arabic storefronts have become a common sight in Istanbul since the beginning of the Syrian civil war. 500,000 displaced Syrians have settled in the city. But unemployment is rising, causing bitterness against refugees. In June, Syrian-owned businesses were attacked in western Istanbul.
They saw that there was Arabic signs at my neighborhood, so they started hitting the storefront with stones. They started destroying it. My Turkish neighbor came out and yelled at them, saying that this is a good Syrian, leave him alone. So they left.
Such attacks are rare in Turkey. There was only one similar attack this year in February, also in western Istanbul. But smaller spats are frequent and are often uploaded on social media.
We will make an effort to create a basis for Syrian migrants to return to their homeland, their free homeland. I'd like to state that clearly. Otherwise, we will have some security concerns that would really trouble us all, and there would be street clashes.
80,000 refugees returned to Syria in the first half of 2019. This is a very small fraction of the actual number of displaced persons in Turkey. Many prefer to stay and build a life here, but some shopkeepers admit they are considering putting up storefront in Turkish in a bid to hide their identity.
Now, Spain has joined Italy in criminalizing migrant rescue by threatening the NGO Open Arms with $1 million fine. The Spanish charity saves migrants in danger of drowning in the Mediterranean Sea. Spain's merchant marine chief Benito Nunes Quintanilla warned the NGO it's not authorized to conduct rescues in the southern Mediterranean. And in the event of a violation, he said the offending ship will be sent to a Spanish port and immobilized. Open Arms operates between Libya and southern Europe, aiding migrants who face danger while crossing from North Africa. The decision comes after Italy arrested Sea Watch's Carola Rackete last month for bringing rescued migrants ashore. Over 600 people, mostly migrants fleeing war and poverty, have died in the Mediterranean this year. South Korea says it will begin hiking tours on a trail in the demilitarized zone. One of the world's most heavily fortified borders, the DMZ, is about 250 kilometers long and 4 kilometers wide. South Korean authorities say group tours near the eastern coastal town of Goseong are expected to begin on July 23rd. Up to 40 people will be allowed per trip. The tour will include a visit to a museum on the DMZ. The project is part of South Korea's attempts to improve inter-Korean peace and stability in the peninsula. The announcement comes after US President Donald Trump and North Korean leader Kim Jong-un met in the DMZ on June 30th. Now, the EU has announced a €72 million financial assistance package for Central Asian states. The program is part of the EU's new Central Asia strategy, announced earlier this month. EU Commission Vice President Federica Mogherini presented the plan at a Central Asia ministerial meeting in Bishkek. It will support regional trade, counter-terrorism, sustainable energy and economic empowerment. 5 former Soviet republics and Afghanistan are the beneficiaries of the plan. The EU and its members are on track to provide over €1 billion in assistance to Central Asia over the period of 2014 to 2020. Now, in Venezuela, newspapers are going digital to survive an economic slowdown. But even online papers are facing problems too, with frequent power outages and low internet access. More in this report.
International Monetary Fund analysts estimate inflation in Venezuela will hit 10 million% this year. Most of the country's citizens are struggling to meet their daily needs. Even newspapers have become a luxury. Most newspaper sellers are unable to sell even 10 papers a day.
I used to sell 80 newspapers a day. Now the situation is so bad, I can hardly sell 3 or 4.
With the economy in shambles and hardly anyone buying papers, media houses no longer have the funds for printing.
We wish to keep reflecting the reality of this country. We want to keep the people informed. It is frustrating that we have been forced to do so only through digital means, because we know it will not have the same impact.
Journalists say it is not just the recent economic crisis which is to blame. In 2013, the state created a company to control newsprint. 58 newspapers have closed down since then.
El Nacional was aggravated in time, but because it was targeted as it was critical of the government attacked it from other sides. He attacked it economically, he attacked it with censorship. I have a prohibition on the National Telecommunications Commission. One of the provisions that I have from the Commission is that I cannot report anything that generates anxiety.
With no end in sight, the country may soon have no free press at all.
Now, being an albino in Africa has its challenges, but that hasn't fazed Lazarus Chigwandali, who's a street musician in southeastern African country of Malawi, and he's become the voice of albinos in the country. Chigwandali is 39 years old and has been playing upbeat tunes on the streets of Malawi's capital, Lilongwe, for years. More in this report. Albinos are often persecuted in Malawi and other southern African countries. Their body organs are often harvested and used for witchcraft. But Chigwandali has defied the odds and reached international fame as a musician.
While in the US, I had the opportunity to perform at Times Square, which is a very prestigious place. Many musicians have never had a chance to perform there. I felt honored that after playing at City Mall here in Malawi, I could also perform at Times Square in the US.
Chigwandali is soon to release a professional album and is also starring in a documentary produced by Madonna. The musician sings in local Chichewa language while playing a homemade banjo and drums.
We want Lazarus' name to be up there in the fighting for persons and the rights of everyone with albinism, so whether in Malawi, in Uganda, in Tanzania, wherever.
Chigwandali hopes to represent people with albinism and bring attention to the plight they face in Africa. Well, good for you, Mr. Chigwandali. Now, from music to art, and whimsical and cleverly decorated sculptures of hay and straw have been put on display in France. The massive artworks have been created at France's annual contest for sculptures in the French Alps. France's unique sculpture contest is nothing less than a challenge for the artists. The sculptors have a free choice of theme, but they have to create monumental sculptures filled and covered with straw and hay. 12 sculptors from around the world have to accomplish the task in just 5 days.
The sculptors who make sculptures have several skills for their art because they have to understand the resistance of the materials, work with the blueprints and master all of that, especially the hay and straw. They are materials which are very flexible.
Chameleon, a giant lizard constructed by a Lithuanian team, won the jury and youth audience prize. Russian's team sculpture, titled The Power of the Subconscious, grabbed the second spot. In the circles from a Czech team clinched the bronze medal.
You have to have improvisation and adaptation. You are given the necessary materials to make what you want, and all of the artists here are great people. And me, working here at Valor, it's my life story.
Each sculptor was given 600 kilos of hay and 400 kilograms of straw to create the massive artworks. They will remain on display throughout the summer. Now, the French government has announced it will fund emission-free transportation projects by taxing plane tickets. The tax will be up to $20 and will be charged on tickets for all flights from airports in France.
During this summer, France faced its worst heat wave ever, with temperatures reaching over 40 degrees Celsius. The United Nations has attributed the change in temperatures to global warming. Now, France has decided to tax plane tickets to fund green transportation projects.
The eco-contribution will be 1.50 euros in eco-class within the European Union, 9 euros within the European Union for business class, 3 euros outside the European Union in eco-class, and 18 euros outside the European Union in business class.
The scheme will begin in 2020 and is expected to collect 182 million euros a year. France also signed the Paris Accord, which aims to strengthen the global response to climate change.
Now, in business news, US stock futures and European shares have retreated alongside Asian equities as markets extended a downbeat trend from the start of the week. But the dollar did strengthen for the third day straight. The S&P 500 futures pointed to a third session of declines as investors await more clues on US monetary policy. The UK's FTSE 100 index decreased less than 0.05%, the lowest in more than a week. Moreover, Germany's DAX index dipped to 0.9%, making it the biggest decrease in over 5 weeks. Stocks reversed gains in Japan, fluctuated in South Korea and saw modest slides in Hong Kong and China. The Stoxx Europe 600 index sank 0.5%, the lowest in more than a week. Well, the US has announced fresh duties on some Mexican and Chinese steel goods, alleging unfair subsidies for manufacturers. The US Commerce Department says imported steel used in construction benefits from subsidies in China, Mexico and Canada. It says the subsidies are negligible in Canada's case, so no retaliatory duties have been imposed. The action is in response to a grievance lodged in February by US steel producers. US customs agents will begin collecting import duties based on the subsidy rates, but the funds could be returned if officials reverse the findings. European stock markets are down across the board in early trading after a bad day in Asia. Germany's DAX index has fallen nearly 1.5%. Paris and London have also lost ground. Early in the day, Asian stocks fell to their lowest levels in 2.5 weeks after hopes dwindled for a US interest rate cut. Mainland Chinese shares slipped significantly, as did Hong Kong's Hang Seng Index. Australia's ASX 200 and South Korea's Kospi indices also declined. Japan's Nikkei 225 recovered marginally after slipping in early trade. The dollar traded at a 3-week high. Now, Japan has rejected South Korea's call to scrap curbs on some high-tech exports. But Seoul says the move will put the global supply chain of smartphones at risk. Japan's industry minister Hiroshige Seko has said that the implementation of these additional measures depends on Seoul's response. South Korea's President Moon Jae-in says the issue has become a concern for the world because it puts the global supply chain of smartphones at risk. The sanctions were imposed after a diplomatic row over forced labor during Japan's occupation of Korea from 1910 to 1945. Japan has threatened further restrictions, saying additional measures depend on South Korea's response. Well, that's the news for now, but do stay tuned for further updates on Indus News throughout the night.